How to bid successfully and win architectural projects. Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about urbanism, architecture, cities and many more. And today I would like to invite you to another episode of Business Development and Communications in Architecture series. I had a big pleasure to talk to Halfdan Krawack, who is the bid manager at AART Architects right now. But we met at Henning Larsen when he was also responsible for business development, working with private clients. And I just thought that it will be very, very useful for you, the listeners, but also for as well me to talk to Halfdan and ask him for his experience in business development and his transition from architecture student to the bid manager at AART Architects right now. We talked about the backstage of Halfdan's professional career, about how to transition from an architect into more communication and business development role, how to successfully bid and apply for architectural projects, how to bring them in the house, and what do you need to be a business developer yourself. We also talked about how to win work. So we referred to Jan Knickers from MVRDV studio book, which is called How to Win Work. I asked about Halfdan's reflection on that book, as well as I asked him on his own advice to offices, studios, or architects who would like to promote their work and bring more work into the house. I think that one of the things that is worth to emphasize during our conversation is that Halfdan said that architecture is about many things, and one of them is driving the business, and that having a business and running it also means selling your hours of your business work. So it is just important to know that architecture, even though it sometimes might have this romantic image of designing our surroundings and designing cities and designing buildings and so on, it is a business on its own as well, and you need to provide a business case for it as well. And one last quote I will just say right now, which will be emphasized in our discussion, is that always try to understand who your client is. And this is one of the most important pieces of advice from Halfdan that I'm really thankful for. As you will hear just in a second, it was one of the funnest settings I have been recording my podcast so far, because we've been recording at plant shop. So it was just extremely nice setting, also in terms of sound quality, I think. So welcome to the newest conversation with Halfdan. Halfdan, welcome.
Thanks, man. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Very excited.
I'm just very happy that we are recording in the most crazy and funny setup that I have ever recorded my podcast in. We are recording in a plant shop.
We are recording in a plant shop. We're actually, to be specific, we're recording in my wife's plant shop, who's very graciously lent it to us today to record this interview in lack of a better studio. But we've discussed this, and acoustics with plants, great.
Yes, I think it's working very nicely.
Yeah, also nice scenery, I would say.
I thought that the setup in the episode with Josefina was quite crazy because we stood in a model workshop, but this is even more crazy, I would say.
This is like the alternative version, but you don't get like the crazy fumes from the sort of glue-in materials that you get in the workshop, I guess. That's the downside.
Yes, I think that this environment is just causing that this talk might be very loose, but of course we would like to keep some content as well. And I think that we will just start with the main topic of our discussion, because I'm just very happy that you joined the series that I've been making for some time, the series about business development and communications in architecture. And I think that when I talk to people working in business development and communications so far in the architecture offices, they have been studying, they've graduated as architects. And I think that it will not be surprised in our discussion as well, because you are also trained as an architect.
That is true. Indeed. I can't hide that fact.
So what happened? What was this main motivation for you to switch, transition, or maybe develop into communication, business development? What was the kind of the first step?
The first inkling of that something had to change? Well, first of all, I think it's a prudent question in terms of also keeping a focus that, for me at least, I always like to help, particularly students who are sort of in the development phase of their careers or haven't started on it yet, to sort of give some insights about like what motivations can be found for doing different things in architecture, even though you have an architectural background. And so for me, at least, I realized during my master studies that, and this is going to sound really awful, that I actually didn't enjoy designing that much per se. Like, so designing buildings was fine. It was interesting and I enjoyed it, but I just had the feeling that something was off. And so during my first internship, during my master's, I had the great sort of privilege of working with a woman called Tine Holmbro, who's now CEO of Disenbikning. And Tine, I remember once sitting down with her and having like a very random conversation about some documents we needed to hand in. And she was working as sort of the sort of day-to-day administrative leader of the particular studio I was working in. And she said, just off cuff, you know what? I really enjoy working with the other side of the business. And then I was like, what do you mean, like the other side of the business? And then she was like, well, you know, architecture is a lot of things. It's both drawing and producing, you know, buildings and drawings for buildings and so on. But it's also very much about driving a business and knowing, you know, how to handle your clients, how to produce bids and so on and so forth. It seems like a very obvious thing now, but at the moment I heard it, I was like, wow, okay, that resonated something with me. And I think from there on out, for me at least, it was very much about also finding out, okay, what opportunities do I have during my master studies to change direction, be it business development or communications? And so I think architecture is such a strong education because it also has such a width of opportunities. And for me, at least, I could see that I could exchange to journalism school. So I did that for 6 months. And after that, I could then apply for a communications internship, which actually happened to be with Josephine Lykke from your previous episode, Small World. But nonetheless, I would say I could also attribute a lot of where I am today to Josephine also because she's such a strong, you say, professional in what she does, but also a very generous manager to have in the day-to-day work. I think probably what you also discussed the last time, Josephine really just pointed out the power of creating and crafting a strong architectural message through the written, you say, media or video or whatever. And we traveled all over the place and did loads of things. So I'm very sort of grateful to have had that experience. And then, say, the final nail on the head where I realized just business development is actually a profession was after I had graduated working in an office as a business developer. I had a manager called Frida Ferdinand who at one point pointed out that, I remember she came over and she said, you know what, Halfdan, yes, I know you're an architect, but you're primarily a business developer. And that will be the sort of core strength when you have to do something different in your life or change directions or change business even. You won't be dependent on working in the building industry. You can do whatever. And I think that's that was, for me at least, a pivotal moment in understanding, like, okay, this is actually a direction that has many more possibilities, perhaps, than I would have had as a drawing architect. Not that there's anything sort of, I could probably also have had a career in that, but I don't think I would have lived up to the sort of hardcore competition of drawing architects. And like, I'm always amazed at looking at architects and seeing like, wow, okay, how did you come up with this? It's amazing. And just realizing like, I could never do that. Yeah.
But I think that the big strength of business development and business developers like you is that you can take this idea, this drawing, and just develop it in a way of other forms like presentation or just showing it to the potential client, gaining this opportunity of developing the project further. And since you also mentioned that you didn't know at the beginning that there is something like business development behind this whole big architecture world, why do you think is that? Because like from the one hand side, it is so important for any architecture office, bigger or smaller, to get the work in, right? So to acquire the projects and promote their work as well. So why do you think that this part of architecture might be maybe a bit underestimated?
Well, I don't know if it's underestimated. I just think it's something that for me at least, it was something that I only met when I was out in the sort of real profession of things. And I think to a certain extent, that also derives from, you could say, a necessity for the schools to sort of prioritize academia and cultural, or sort of, in Danish is called kunstnerisk praksis, but you could say artistic expression and artistic development, which, and also you could say a practical knowledge of how materials work and how sort of a building is put together and so on and so forth, is totally sensible. But you could argue that perhaps there would be a value created in having subjects that specifically talked about management of architectural offices and business development and sales and acquisitions and PR and so on. But I think to a certain degree, you also see that happening now. I know at the Copenhagen School of Architecture, at least, that they have a program that's sort of, half of them is Copenhagen Business School and half of them are architects, which I think is such a brilliant idea. I remember sort of hearing about it and being like, oh, I want to do that. I like that.
Yeah, it is a very interesting project. I know this one, and I think that it gives this broader overview of how can architecture be connected with business. But I think that my question was more about this education part, because I know that principals, partners, or people who are working with architecture for a longer period of time, they are very aware of the business development part. But I think that this is what you mentioned before, that once you graduate or you are still at school or you're a young architect, I think that you don't know that it is so important and that you actually have so many paths in architecture, that if you are interested in architecture, in urbanism, in creating the world around you, it is not only through the drawing, it can be on many different ways. So I think that this might be lacking a bit.
Well, yeah, you could definitely argue that perhaps it would be adequate to have a stronger, say, presence of the sort of other aspects of architecture within school. The question is really if it's manageable within the time frame that's given. But I also think it's also why sort of internships and sort of going out and acquiring practical knowledge by working in an office is during your studies is really a valuable asset, and it's one that really, at least in Denmark, sets the architectural education apart from many others. And that also sort of dresses you and gives you sort of you could say a direction for what you want to do with the master studies when you get back. And then you could always question whether when you come back to school, if the school can then accommodate your newfound interest in communications or not. But at least I think sort of internships in that sense are just like, if you have the possibility to do it, go. It's the best thing you can do. Or going abroad to a different country and studying abroad. It's also a complete eye-opener, I think.
I can't believe that your transition was without any challenges or harder moments. And this is something I would like really to ask you about, because I just think that the listeners who maybe also would like to get to know something more about business development, or maybe transition into business development or PR side of architecture themselves, I think that they should be aware that there might be maybe not problems, but more challenges in this transition. And I would really ask you for being honest now. What were the main challenges you faced?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the main challenge, I could be very specific with this, was staying away from school for 1.5 years before returning and doing my thesis project, which is is an idiotic idea. You should never do that. I cannot recommend it to anybody. And I think the general issue was that I had been away for so long and working in a professional office that coming back into academia, I couldn't really navigate anymore. And I just remember being very conflicted about how to apply what I was sort of had really gained a fondness about, working with communications in this case, then later on business development, applying that specifically and arguing that it had the same value as drawing a building for a thesis project. And so I think it's also a healthy exercise in terms of arguing, like, why do you think what you should be doing the rest of your life is an important trait for the particular school? And I think depending on where you are and where you're educated, that can be a big challenge. It can also be a minor challenge. It depends on how the university is structured, I guess. And also, you could say, without becoming too technical, what is the sort of requirements for the universities to their students, which are often set as a contract between a state ministry and the school. So obviously there are some things that you need to do. Can't get around them, but you can sort of tweak them a bit. So yeah, I think that was a major challenge. I remember being fairly stressed out about it, actually. I think that was like the only time in my studies where I was really like, okay, this is tough and this is going to be a challenge. And then thankfully I had a professor who was like-minded and could see the prospect of why communication and business development is an inherent trait of being an academic architect or being an architect.
And once you overcame the struggle, and
by finishing
by finishing your school, and once you became the person who started to work with PR and communication, business development, how did you learn how to be successful in that position? Yeah, did it just come with time, or was it some practical advice from your coworkers? I'm just curious about this learning process. And I'm also asking both for my listeners, but also for myself.
Yes, I think perhaps also a good time to put in the disclaimer that you started working as a business developer.
Yes.
Yes, congratulations. That's so cool. Well done. You. But no, I mean, returning...
Cheers.
Cheers. We also brought beers to the plant shop just to make things even more nice. No, but returning to your question. So what are the sort of practical aspects of learning how to work with PR, business development? And I think it makes sense to actually use a term that we'll return to later on. I think, or a definition that's been coined by a person we'll talk about later on, where you could say that PR and business development are two sides of marketing. And so whereas marketing works as an umbrella for everything, then PR is the sort of long-term definition or sort of scoping of the brand. And then you have, which also contains communications. And then on the other side, you have business development, which basically is sales and acquisitions. And I think it's important also to be honest about that having a business and running a business also means that you have to sell hours to actually make the business work. And understanding and grasping that is just like key aspect. You don't need to package this in any other way. You just need to understand that this is the way the business runs, and it's fine. It's good. But I would say I was lucky that I started in a fairly big office that had an existing and pretty well organized business development organization. So there was a lot of practical advice I could draw from my colleagues. At the same time, I would say I had been hired in the role as business developer specifically because I also had a bit of a different approach. I didn't work with public tenders. I worked with private clients, specifically throughout the Nordic markets. I was very interested in how we used like digital media to figure out like how to work with clients and so on, and how to use our message and being very aware of the communication skills that I had and applying them. And then I would say there's a lot of trial and error, which I think if you're in an office that can be forgiving about that, then you're in a good place and you should definitely stay because you will make mistakes. I did a lot. And then also just sort of being humble and working hard. I don't think, I have to say, like, this is for me, I think the key strength to having a career today. And I would say I'm definitely at the start of my career, but my strategy has always just been to like work hard, stay focused, get it done, but also like be aware of what's happening around you and keeping a strategic focus on what's ahead. Because I definitely didn't get to where I am by charm or by good looks or by being a genius. It's definitely as much hard work as being a regular architect, I think.
So there is this part where you really need to work hard. Yeah. And it brings me to my next question, because once you compare the work of an architect designing and also sometimes staying overtime and finishing some projects before the deadline, once you apply for a project instead to acquire some new opportunity to the office as a business developer, you also meet some deadlines. So it means that you also sometimes need to stay longer and just work longer as well. But how would you compare this kind of profile of working in business development versus working as an architect? What are the common fields? And where does it differ the most?
I think, I mean, for me at least, working with business development also means working in a competitive environment. Not internally, but of course externally, because you're applying against other companies. So it has a lot of similarities to working with competition architecture. It's like, but I think the main difference is, of course, that when you're applying for projects, be it a public tender or private pitch or doing a bid for a specific project, it's pretty condensed. It's perhaps a month or 2 months, and then it's like very intensive. But you also really need to be focused on what's ahead. So you're always planning ahead, always keeping an eye on what were the strategic goals. And if there's any upcoming projects in 6 months, you need to be aware that you have to do the teaming and have to do the preparation, have to take the client meetings and be aware of what stakeholders need to be approached before you can actually do the bid. And I think that's also the exciting part of the work, that you need to have that duality of both being able to work very intensively on something, but still keeping an eye out in the distance and seeing what's going on. You could say the end goal is always to have a healthy pipeline of projects running in. So you don't sort of spend all your time doing applications. And then you're very busy. And then all of a sudden, then because you didn't focus on what was ahead, you have like a big gap and no projects coming in. That's really sort of the worst situation you could be in as a sort of bid manager or business developer. But it also means that you have quite a bit of sort of diversity during your everyday work.
Yeah.
You could both be working on an application or a pitch or whatever, but you could just as well be out meeting with clients, or you could be speaking to collaborators, or you could sort of be doing desktop research, or being out in the field talking to whoever, or screening leads. And for me, at least, that flexibility is really a key aspect of why I enjoy that work. But of course, as you were mentioned to begin with, there are deliverables. It will be high-paced, so you need to also enjoy that part of the work. But I wouldn't say, just to sort of round that aspect, I wouldn't say I've never felt it as a stressful aspect. And that even applies now. I became a father very recently, not quite recently, a year ago. And I think for me, the sort of defining moment was sort of starting off with work again and then seeing, okay, how do I balance being a father and being a present dad, then with the combination of also having requirements and a obligation that I feel towards my employer. And I think that's totally doable. It's very much about how you prioritize and being selective in the way you approach assignments and the work you do, which I think sort of applies, of course, for everything, but especially for competitive work. You need to be like super selective, but also to ensure that you pick the right projects to apply for.
And that comes with time, I guess.
Yeah. Yes. And I would say it's not like, I don't think anybody really learns it 100%. You will always make mistakes. And that's also important to sort of be fair to yourself, I think.
To continue the topic of changes, we both had some changes in the recent time. And for you, the change was that you also joined the new studio with a new role, the bid manager. And this is something that interests me a lot, because I think that it's not often that I see that position, especially the bid manager. It's often that you might see someone who is just acquiring projects, like project acquisitor or a business developer or business development coordinator. So how bid manager is different from that role? Is that different?
Well, yeah. Well, you could say to a certain degree, it's down to the wording of what the company believes fits the best sort of description of the job you're doing. And that can be different from company to company. And so I think the most direct translation from my title in Danish to English is actually bid manager. And that was why we chose it. And also because I do have a very specific focus on producing bids. At the same time, you could say I also do a lot of other things that you could connect to, I guess, like a business development manager, which is basically, sort of when in the daily task of things, organizing teams, searching for projects, screening, producing applications, also making sure that you're actually fulfilling whatever strategy the company has. But you could say the overall most important thing, and I think the overall task, whatever you call yourself, bid manager or business development manager or business development coordinator or whatever, is that you are acutely aware that what you're working with is taking your company's or studio's unique selling points and transforming that into a meaningful value proposition for the client. And in that process, that you are also aware who the client's client are, because that allows you to understand the sort of the view of the world of your own client. So let's say that you were drafting a proposal or a bid for a, affordable housing organization. And it's really, really important that you understand that the affordable housing organization's client depends on a fairly low rent. So you can't go around sort of building everything out of gold and silver and being like, oh, I'll just spend like a gazillion square meters on nothing. It doesn't work that way. And by demonstrating that you understand what the priorities of the client are, you also make you'll make, of course, life a lot easier for the client, but you also make life a lot easier for the architects then that will sort of take on the project afterwards. If you've defined a very clear scope of what is the assignment, what are the priorities. So recently I started working for AART Architects, which is a sort of a Nordic office with offices and studios in Aarhus, in Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Oslo. And one of the sort of unique things about is that they've invested heavily in, you could say, research into social sustainability, but also in how you document the effect of architecture and do it in a systemic way where you can actually use it both as a post-occupancy evaluation and then reuse it in the next project. So you know, okay, this was the learnings for this particular client or this particular typology, and then we can reuse it in the project afterwards, in the new project that comes around. And of course, that's incredibly strong, I think, both because it actually informs on the architecture that's being drawn, so it becomes better. But of course, also in the sense that build a really sound business case for the client by actually proving that you can document what you've been postulating throughout the project. You don't just go out there with vision, you actually go back and revisit and say, okay, what does it then mean in like a specific effect? And that could be a direct effect of the architecture, it can also be an indirect effect. And so for me, at least, working as a bid manager today is also very much working actively with that particular trait of the office and turning that into, you say, an operational tool for the client and saying, okay, how does this actually create value for you in your specific setting and your specific environment? And of course, having a background within PR and knowing how to craft communication is, of course, an advantage in that, but I don't think it's sort of a necessity as such. But it also means that, you say, the task of being a bid manager compared to being a business developer isn't perhaps that different, really. My focus is just like very much also on producing bids and making sure that when we send something to a client that it actually corresponds to their worldview, but also that it's sort of balanced with the capacity we have in the office or the fee that we think is correct to make quality architecture.
And how to balance between this fixed point of an architecture studio. So I basically mean that, for example, if you find your biggest strengths, and this is something that you emphasized as well, your kind of language, your narrative, and this kind of selling point. So this is one thing. This is something that is briefly fixed. But there is this other thing that you should be kind of adjustable to the customer's needs, to the client's needs, to the specific site and the project. So you kind of also need to make this tailor-made offer, bid, or proposal, and how to balance between those two. So how to reach this kind of the midpoint, I would say.
Yeah, the sort of the golden in between. Well, I think you could say I don't necessarily 100% agree that the values as such are fixed. They're fixed in the sense that, of course, it's an agreed upon, you could say, set of values that you go out with and that you operate by. And that kind of makes sense. And I think sort of they are, as you could say, flexible in the sense that they also grow when you meet, you could say, like-minded clients or collaborators. And I think you have to allow for that growth, that you sort of also say, well, this is our values, but we also grow by them and with them. And also, it also comes when you're looking after specific clients that you want to work with, or of course, part of, you say, assessing whether it might be a good match to work for a specific client is also assessing whether we believe that the values that we have corresponds with the clients. And that goes both ways. I mean, of course, that's also super important for the client and the users of that specific building, as much as it applies for people we collaborate with, and that we do it in a way that is fair and correct. And that's, for me at least, is really important that you have your ethics with you when you go out and acquire work. And I think that also shows in the projects. When you can tell if it's a good match, you can also just tell it's going to be a good project. And that's like for me at least, is one of the best feelings, being able to shape a potential future architecture by ensuring that it's a good match of values, but also that the team taking over and actually drawing the building has good conditions, are aware of the client's priorities, and also seeing that the client or our collaborators have a fruitful process. And I think at the end of the day, because consultancy is also selling hours, and that's how you kind of survive. You also have to raise the question to yourself, what is the effect of those hours? Are you selling hours because you need to produce drawings? That's perhaps not value creation, but are you producing something that moves in a particular client or particular organization and creates positive impact? And I think that's incredibly powerful. And when that happens, you go home really proud and happy, and then you hope and you believe that your colleagues who are actually drawing the building will produce something amazing, which is, I have to say, always the case. I'm always amazed by what the architects will do. And I'm always like, wow, I didn't see it coming. Like I didn't see it coming, and I'm totally stoked about it.
Okay, that was just my next question about the most rewarding part, because from the experience of a designer myself, I can say that, of course, once you are working on a competition, the most kind of happy, joyful, and rewarding moment is once you just submit the project. And of course, the second nicest feeling is once you win the competition. And how it looks like in your field?
It's very much actually the continuation of that notion of seeing the project develop. I've always been like a advocate for celebrating whenever the project goes into the next phase. So when it leaves one stage and goes into another, I think that should totally be a champagne-worthy gathering and celebration, because it is like the next offset for the future architecture. And then, of course, also seeing the building in action and seeing it working and following it throughout the years. So it should also I don't think I said that at the beginning, but my career hasn't been like ages and ages and ages. I'm talking like, oh, I've been doing this for years and years. That's totally not true. I started when did I finish? 2016. But I've been lucky enough to see one of the first buildings that I was on a team, which we acquired, be finished and actually is now in operation. Whenever I pass it, I'm like very, very happy and proud to see what it turned into, and proud to have known the architects who actually grew it and stood for sort of all the sort of final stages in terms of construction and following it up to the point of delivery. It never really ceases to amaze me how that works.
Of course, I agree that your career is not like extremely long yet, and there is a lot of things to learn still. But I also think that you gained enough experience to share a piece of it with the listeners, I hope.
Yes. Well, I think I think also being close to the point of where I graduated from, I think is really important. I have to say, like, I was very fortunate when I was studying that tons of people helped me along the way and were always open to being contacted about the most random stuff I could think about in terms of career. So if I can help anyone, I'm very happy about it. So, and also, I mean, in that sense, I think Urbcast is such a seminal media for actually talking about the very early stages of career and where you want to go and so on. So, yeah.
Yes, and that's why I'm happy that we started this conversation with talking about this development and this transition from studies into the kind of the working environment. And I guess that there are also some students listening to us, but I hope that there are also some people who are listening to us who are responsible themselves for acquiring projects and for winning work, because winning work is something that I would like to talk about right now. And especially I would like to ask you how to win work. And How to Win a Work is also a title of a book written by Jan Knicker from MVR The View. And this is a very interesting book. I've already recommended that on LinkedIn, and many people just wrote to me afterwards and said that they are very happy that I recommended this book, because it is kind of very nice set of practical advice on how to develop this business side of an architecture office. So what would be your number one tip for architects, but for also maybe for architecture studios who are thinking about how to kind of level up their efficiency if it comes to acquiring projects?
I think, oh man, being pitched against Jan Knicker, that's a tough one. It's as an offset, I would say it's a nice book. I wish it had been published when I started, because there's so many things where like, I wish I knew that and didn't have to like invent things myself. But yeah, I think without sort of trying to or accidentally sort of paraphrasing what Jan Knicker sort of talks about, I think for me at least, one of the most important aspects of being or producing successful bids or working successfully with business development is also about staying focused and staying true. And that sounds kind of lofty, but I actually think it kind of rings true that you really need to stick by your values and be honest with yourself about what do you want to work with. And at the same time, be pragmatic about sort of what can be done. I had an interesting conversation the other day with an architecture studio which started a few years ago. And it was started by like very senior project managers. Like they had been out and working for years and years and had big networks. And so during the course of the conversation, they sort of told me about sort of how they had made this very elaborate strategy and been like very specific about what do we work with and what do we apply for. And then after about 2 months, they were like, okay, this doesn't work. We need to like think broader and actually get some work in so we can hire some people, so we can have some volume, and then we can start to decide. And I think that was also kind of a nice point that you need to find that balance between being, you could say, focused and selective, but also, of course, making your office run in a good and practical way, and being minded about spreading out the risk of you don't have one project with one client only, but you have perhaps several. Some of them are private, some of them are public, and so on. And I think that's very that applies for all sectors of, at least in building industry, but I think also generally in consulting, that carving out your niche as a consulting company and standing out from the crowd, be it, I mean, having, say, invested in social sustainability research or practical methods of documenting things, or being like very nerdy about CLT or whatever. I mean, if you have something that is uniquely yours and that is of you could say, a knowledge that taking time to acquire and actually grow, that is a great offset for growing a business. And then, of course, I don't want to talk too much about the practical things. I would then actually just want to recommend Jan Knikker's book, because I think there are so many nice practical tips. And I think also not being afraid to go out and talk to clients, and not being afraid to go out and talk to collaborators, and not being afraid to fail, because that happens a lot. And you learn so much from doing it. And then hopefully you don't mess up the big ones. And if you don't do that, you'll be fine.
So your number tip would be just don't mess up the big projects.
Don't mess up the big projects. Yeah, exactly. That's the number one tip. I mean, I would say definitely stay true to your values and don't be afraid to go out and test if they sort of can be applied in a practical sense, and always try to understand who your client is and what their motivation is for doing things. If you do that, then I think it's a pretty good offset. And then all the practical stuff, you can learn that along the way. Invent it or read a book.
I didn't want to put you against Jan Knikker, because we both know that this book is very brilliant, and in terms of ideas that Jan is sharing with the readers. But I just really thought that we can enrich this vision of his, and that we can put it more into the Danish or especially Copenhagen context, because this is the place we are recording this conversation and where we are both living, actually. This brings me to this last wrap-up question that I would like to ask you. And this could be still more in this Danish context. I think that there are also like many people listening to this podcast and hear this small architecture Copenhagen bubble as well. The question is, do you think that architects in general, or those based in Danish offices or in Copenhagen offices, can promote themselves and can promote their work? Like, how does it work in the Danish context? Because I think that one of the things that I realized in Danish society, that you rather don't want to step out, right? You rather would like to become, I don't know if the word average is good, but just rather to not be come just in front, kind of, maybe, to put it that way. So do you think that the architecture offices, architects especially, can promote themselves, or they rather prefer to kind of stay low?
Well, I think, to be fair, I think a lot of them are actually doing it. I think a lot of them have developed a very, very skilled approach to it. And I think that comes from a range of offices during specifically sort of the mid-2000s, which really sort of caught on to the idea of using communication in a very different way in architecture without being very specific about who they were. I think they've really sort of also made it a bit more legitimate to talk about the business side of things and how to use branding. That being said, I think there's always a lot to learn. I think both from other industries, to be honest. I think one of my sort of things I really want to do this year is I want to sort of create a group of, you could say, people engaged within acquisition sales that are not architects, like from random sectors, not random sectors, but other sectors. It could be like pharma, it could be other parts of consulting, management consulting, and so on, and just seeing how they work and how they sort of use sort of sales and marketing and PR in different ways than we do within our own sector at the moment. I think that's at least one aspect, because I definitely feel a need to sort of grow. And I also think we can learn a lot from other countries and other ways of doing things. One of the most, you could say, fear-provoking things that I used to do was call my sort of American colleagues when I was working in a different office. because they are like very upfront and like very sort of business minded. And it's great because you get like a jolt of lightning. You're like, oh, I didn't know we could do this. And they were like, yes, of course you can do this. I mean, go get it done. Talk to these people. Like, what are you waiting for? Which is great. You need to sort of put yourself out of the comfort zone every once in a while. And I think, even though I actually think Danish architects are pretty good at promoting themselves, you can see that internationally as well. I mean, it's going fairly good with the export of Danish design and architecture. I think there's always room for improvement, definitely. And I think there's also reason to keep ahead. I mean, in terms of being specific to what is the unique selling point of any given office. Also because you see, as with anything, once something has become a trend for a while, it loses its sort of symbolic value. I mean, be it sustainability. You can almost not say the word today because, yes, of course, everybody works sustainable. Thankfully, or do they? But I think you need to stay ahead and you need to invest in things that actually creates value for both your office, but obviously also for your clients. And at the end of the day, the people who are going to use the buildings that you produce or the landscapes that you draw, the planning that you do.
Speaking of the outreach part of acquiring projects, do you think that it is possible to work in business development once you are more introvert, that you don't like being very, social, talkative and outreaching to people?
I don't know. It's a good question. I've never thought. It's funny because I've actually never thought about it in that way.
I just feel that I'm feeling very comfortable with reaching out to people and talking to them. And of course, this is why I'm leading the podcast as well. But I can believe that there are some people who really need to spend a lot of energy to kind of be on that level, to talk to people, to outreach to strangers.
Well, I think it kind of depends really, because you could say that because business development or sales and acquisitions is a fairly broad profession, you will always need people who can also, doesn't necessarily have to go out and create or work with outreach in, i.e. sort of meeting with people or calling or whatever. You also need the ones that are like super focused, works with public tenders perhaps. I mean, that's always written and always behind the screen of anonymity for good reason. And you need those people who are just like very, very strong in research and background checks and all those kind of things where I, for one, I'm very acutely aware that that's not always my strongest side. I need to really sort of apply myself to sit down, be thorough in my reading, be like very on sharp about analyzing sort of written tenders when they come out. And I think, so you definitely need like both personality traits. I don't think one sort of cancels the other out. You need both really, or you need multiple aspects of it. In the same way that you need people who aren't architects to work as business developers. You need somebody who can come in and ask questions that you hadn't thought about.
Yeah.
I remember we had once hired an intern, and the specific reason we hired him was because he was not an architect. He came from a very different background. And he was amazing in many sense, but also just because you come in and ask questions that were sort of blatantly obvious, but at the same time was sort of like very important to actually reconsider. I remember once he came in and he said, how do we actually make money in this place? And I was like, that's a good question. Like, that is actually a very good question. Why are we doing this the way we are doing it? Is the way we're like making money, is that actually the right way we're doing it? Does it create the right amount of value? Is it even efficient for the client, the way we're producing our bids at the moment and so on? So I think, it's always of great value to have other professional identities within your team. And I think you should definitely try and strive to acquire it by all means.
It's never too late to learn and educate yourself. And that brings me to my last question, which will be about the book recommendation. We talked about a book already, but maybe you have something else to recommend to the listeners.
Yes. My recommendation for a book is by a French philosopher. And sorry, all French-speaking people, I'm going to mispronounce his name now. It's called Henry Lefebvre, I think. But the book specifically is called The Production of Space, which I read when I was studying in Berlin. I exchanged during my bachelor studies, I think. And the nice thing about German architects is that they're sort of very grounded within philosophy and have a very strong tradition for reading philosophy. And so we were asked immediately to read this book and not show up before we had done it. And without going too much into detail about the sort of broader aspects of the book, what I think at least it did for me is that it really opened my eyes to thinking about space, not necessarily as a physical aspect, but also thinking about space of politics or economy or social space. And it should be noted that the author was a Marxist, and the book is also has a lot of Marxist notions. And it wasn't because I turned into a Marxist reading it, but I think it was really good. So being aware, and I still think it's really good being aware of the systems that you work within or the framework that you work within, and also how you look at space and how that space then translates into society or economy and so on and so forth. Especially as a business developer. There's also a very enjoyable passage where he berates Bauhaus for being like a puppet of the state. But I would say read it. It's not a book that you can sort of just pick up and read 5 minutes and then put down again. Well, if you're a genius, then probably yes. You need to sort of apply yourself a bit. But I think if you do that, it's definitely the reward worth it.
Halfdan, thank you very much for this book recommendation and for the knowledge as well, for sharing your experience. And I think that even though we also had this very cozy environment recording this conversation, with having some drinks and being surrounded by these beautiful plants, we also managed to share some valuable knowledge with the listeners. I hope that we reached that goal. So I'm just very thankful.
Well, thank you, Martin. I think thank you for having me on the podcast. Keep up the great work. I hope to see you out there, and I sort of look forward to listening to the next episode that's coming out.
Thank you, and I hope to talk to you soon and meet up soon again in this flower shop.
Plant shop, should be said. Only green plants. Yeah, by all means, let's say that. All right.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast. I hope that it was a very useful knowledge that you got from Halfdan. If you are interested to hear more about business development in architecture, feel free to listen to different episodes of my business development and communication in architecture series, as well as you are free to contact Halfdan and ask for any advice. As he said in our discussion, he also was getting one from the people he met during his career. He would love to share his knowledge as well. So thank you one more time. If you would like to follow Urbcast on social media, you can visit my Facebook, LinkedIn or Instagram. And also feel free to write me a message on one of those social media platforms or just writing to my email info@urbcast.pl. Thank you and talk to you soon.